very expensive. And this like challenging game at all, you just rely on a proof. So, the core principle is basically that instead of lots of transactions and everyone verifies every transaction, it is you take the transactions, you strip them down and compress them as much as possible, then stick that on the blockchain. You do need to stick something on the blockchain just so that everyone else can like keep up to date with the state, so they know what all the contracts are, what all the balances are, and all of this. But it's a very small amount of data, and then you use one of these other off-chain games. Could be this optimistic game, could be a ZK Snark, to just prove that somebody out there did the computation and the result is correct, right? So you're pushing like 90% of the work off-chain, and then 90% of the data and 99% of the computation off-chain, and then you still have 10% of the data and 1% of the computation on-chain, and so your scalability goes up by a factor of about 100. So these systems are already live for some applications, right? So there's something called Buterin, which is just a ZK rollup for payments, right? So you can have assets inside of the Buterin system, and you can go around and transfer them, but and you get like much lower transaction fees, right? Like instead of $5, you'd have to pay like less than 5 cents. But the only problem is that this only supports a couple of applications right now. Like making one that supports anything that you can do on Ethereum just takes a bit more work, but that's being done as well, right? So like within a few months, I'm expecting, fully Ethereum capable rollups to be available as well. So rollups, just summarizing, do most of the work off chain, put only a little bit on chain, factor of 100 scaling, sharding, another factor of 100 scaling, 100 times 100 factor of 10,000, hundreds of thousands of transactions a second, and there's your scalability.
Okay, so you achieve scalability, you can do a large number of transactions very quickly, and the cost of doing those transactions is much lower. You wrote that in the long term, ZK rollups are going to win in terms of layer 2 technology. Specifically, you wrote, in general, my own view is that in the short term, optimistic rollups, as you were saying, are likely to win out of general purpose EVM computation, and ZK rollups are likely to win out for simple payments, exchange, and other application-specific use cases, just as you were saying. But in the medium to long term, ZK rollups will win out in all use cases as ZK Snark technology improves. Why do you think ZK rollups are going to win the big picture battle over layer 2 technologies?
So I think ZK rollups, like once you accept that the technology works, are just like conceptually simpler and they have nicer properties. The reason is that they do not have this concept of a challenge game, right? Like as I mentioned, in an optimistic rollup, the way that you ensure that the results are correct is that you let one person submit, and like they just submit with no proof. They just say, here's what I think the result is. And then if someone else disagrees, they make their own submission. And then if you have 2 disagreeing submissions, then you actually publish it on chain and you see who's right. But for this to work, like you need to actually wait for someone to disagree, right? So like, for example, if I have an asset inside of an optimistic rollup and I want to withdraw it, then I actually have to wait a week to withdraw it, because like if a block that contains my withdrawal turned out to be invalid, then there needs to be space for someone to disagree with it, right? Whereas with a ZK rollup, like you don't need time for disagreement because you just have a proof, right? As soon as a block is submitted, there's a proof, and it's correct.
So if disagreements, especially in the long term, are sparse, then you don't want to do the optimistic, the game theoretic thing. You want to do the ZK Snark.
Right. The ZK stuff is just like you can, in a ZK rollup, you can withdraw immediately. You don't have to like worry about the economics of proving as much. Right. There's just like fewer issues. The reason why ZK rollups are not winning everywhere today is because, ZK Snarks is still a crazy new technology, right? Like this is something that 10 years ago, it existed only in theory and there was none in practice. Then, 8 years ago, people were just getting excited about it in Bitcoin conferences for the first time. Starting 4 years ago, or 3.5 years ago even, that was the first time you were able to make any ZK Snark based anything on Ethereum. And then people started making them, and ZK technology has only really become efficient enough to do a lot of things within the past maybe 1.5 years. So It's new technology. It's crazy technology. It's admittedly scary technology. If you want to learn more, I also have an article about this on
Yeah, you do.
vitalik.ca.
It's actually really, really good. You're
No.
most of your writing, it's technical, but it's accessible. I highly, highly recommend to check out Vitalik's articles and blogs, whatever you call them, on
Yeah,
your
but
website. It's brilliant summary of the work. Actually, Ethereum documentation period is really good. I think that's somewhat crowdsourced. That documentation is really, really accessible and brilliant. But let me ask about sort of other approaches to layer 2, like side chains. So the one popular one is Polygon. What are your thoughts about Polygon, which is a layer 2 network? Is it positive? Is it negative for Ethereum? Is it both? Does it have a future, which is its own chain, but it's using Ethereum? It's like based on Ethereum essentially. Or maybe you can describe what it is.
Yeah. So I think there's a really big and important difference in security models between rollups and sidechains, which is basically that rollups inherit from the security of Ethereum, right?
Yes.
So like if I have coins inside of Loopring or Optimism or Arbitrum or ZK Sync, then even if everyone else in the world who is participating in these ecosystems like hates me and wants to steal my money, I can still personally like make sure that no matter what happens, I get my money out. It might be a bit expensive for me to get my money out, and I have to do transactions like on the main chain, but I'll be able to do it. Whereas in Polygon, which is a sidechain, and so instead of being secured by Ethereum, it's also in part secured by its own proof of stake consensus with its own token. So if 70% of the whole, or even 51% of the holders of Polygon tokens wanted to take my money in Polygon, they can, right? So that's and like, to be fair, like there aren't even like the supply, I don't think, is even that widely distributed, right? So like potentially you could this idea of 51% of the token holders coming together and stealing everything, like it's not impossible, right?
Where does the scaling of Polygon come from? Like, why is it able to process much more transactions than the Ethereum main chain? What's the idea there?
I think in part, I imagine, I'm not sure exactly what its capacity level is, but like I imagine it has a higher capacity because it's a bit more willing to take centralization trade-offs. And then another thing is that like if the Ethereum ecosystem, like even if it did not do that, right? If you think about an Ethereum ecosystem hypothetically scaling with sidechains, then you would have 100 copies of Polygon, and they would each have their own tokens, they would each have their own chains, and so even if each one of those chains was only as scalable as Ethereum, you could still, like, the total sum of them would still be 100 times more than Ethereum.
Okay.
The thing that I want to say in Polygon's favor, just to be very fair to them, like, I really, I definitely really, respect the work that they're doing. Yes. So, start with a bit with that word of not criticism, caution, right? Like it's that they made this kind of deliberate trade-off for very pragmatic reasons, which is that the Ethereum ecosystem needs to scale now, and there are applications that want to do something now. And if there aren't Ethereum-friendly options for them, then like they're not going to just wait peacefully and do nothing for 12 months. They're going to go to either Binance Smart Chain or one of some other system, or potentially something that just has totally no alignment with Ethereum values whatsoever. But whereas with Polygon, like the best thing that you can say in Polygon's favor and against Optimism is that Optimism is not live and Polygon is live, right? Like it just takes more work to create a system that has these extra roll-ups security features. And so Polygon just said, we're going to be the system that makes the pragmatic trade-off. We're going to go, functionality first, and then, we can talk about adding back the security later. So I've talked to them, and like in principle, I think they're very, open to the idea of like adding more security and like becoming a roll-up, or at least adding a Polygon chain that's a roll-up at some point in the future, which is definitely something I think they absolutely should follow through on. But like the fact that like they exist now, and so applications can kind of bootstrap now on a chain that even though its security isn't perfect, at least it exists and people can go use it. And then over time, the chain matures as the applications mature. Like it's, I think, a very reasonable strategy, and I'm definitely really happy that they're part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The history of cryptocurrency has this tension of really good ideas that are hard to implement, so they take longer to implement, and ideas that are not as good but are faster to implement. This is like the story of like you have like JavaScript that basically took over the world because it was quick to implement within 10 days, and then like later kept fixing itself. I don't know what to make of that. Sort of from an engineering perspective, I'm more and more becoming comfortable and accepting the fact that our whole world will run a technology that's not as good as it could have been, just because the crappy solution is faster to implement and it sticks. What do you make of that tension?
I think the compromise that we've been taking within Ethereum is like when we have to take the crappy solution, we look for crappy solutions that are forward compatible with becoming good over time. Right, like when you build the quick and dirty thing, like you would still already have ideas in your head about what the more complete thing with all the security features added on would look like, right?
Even if it requires a hard fork.
Yes, like even so, like for example, with sharding, right? Like, I think it's likely that the first version of sharding that comes out, like, is not going to have zk snarks and data availability sampling, for example. But we know what these technologies are. We feel like we, have wrapped our heads around them, and so we know how to build a system where we can put all the pieces in place so that it becomes very easy to bolt those components on in the future. So like if you do things that way, right, then at the beginning you can have your system that has the functionality, but say has less security or like less sustainability or less of something else. But then over time, like it's designed in such a way that it has this easy on ramp to adding those things, right? And if you don't think explicitly about like being future compatible, then you do often end up with a quick and dirty solution that backs you into a corner. And I mean, there are definitely cases where like I think the Ethereum ecosystem has suffered from that, and we have had to like expend pretty significant effort on, for example, removing features that we didn't realize that we actually can't sustain. Right. Like one big example is just increasing the gas costs. So like making some operations more expensive when they because they should be expensive because they actually take a lot of time in the process. Right. So that's making like some things more expensive, kind of like taking some functionality away. So if you can like be cognizant of where you're likely going into the future, and if you don't know, like even be cognizant of both the most likely paths that you'll take in the future, and thinking about your roadmap and coming up with a roadmap where that like if you wants to do either of those things, then you have a clean path toward it. Like, that's probably the best kind of practical way to get the best of both worlds that we have.
Okay, let's talk about this wonderful process of merging. Okay, so there's the main net, which is the Ethereum 1.0 chain, or what should we say? The chain that uses proof of work as the consensus mechanism. And then there's, what is it called? The beacon chain that uses the proof of stake mechanism. And I believe the beacon has been deployed successfully, is working. So that was in December 2020. There's a bunch of questions around that that's fascinating as well. But I think the most fascinating question is about merging those two. When do the two chains, one that's proof of work, one that's proof of stake, merge? And what are the most difficult parts of this process?
Right. So as you've said, right, the way that we have set up this proof of stake transition is that at first, the proof of stake chain just launches on its own, right? And this is the thing that happened in December. And the proof of stake chain has been running for close to 6 months now. I mean, by the time people watch this, it might actually be 6 months. But it isn't actually coming to consensus on anything except for itself, right? So the idea behind that is to just give the proof of stake chain time to mature, time for people to build the ecosystem around it, time to make sure that there aren't any bugs, and just like prove to the community that proof of stake actually is real and it's and a full transition is realistic because the thing that you're transitioning to already exists and already works. And then at some point in the future, you have this event called the merge, where you basically take the activity that's being done inside of the proof of work chain and you actually move it over into the proof of stake chain, so you get rid of the proof of work side completely. So the way that the merge will work is, it's definitely gone through a few different iterations. Like the earlier versions of this actually required more work for users and more work for clients. It was much more like, oh, there's this new chain, there's this old chain, and then everyone has to like migrate from the old chain to the new chain, and then at some point we'll forget about the old chain. The new version is designed to be much more seamless for users. Right. So basically what actually happens is that the old chain basically becomes embedded inside the new chain. Right. So starting from the merge transition block, every proof of stake chain block is going to contain a block of the what we consider to be the Ethereum chain today, but we'll call it the execution chain. And then at the same time, to create one of these blocks, you're not going to need proof of work anymore, right? So basically, at the same time, you would both get rid of the proof of work requirements for one of these blocks to be valid, but instead you require these blocks to be embedded inside of the proof of stake blocks, right? So you basically have like a chain inside a chain. And this is, from an architecture perspective, it's, you might think it's a little bit suboptimal, but it actually has some nice properties. It makes it easier to kind of think about the consensus and think about what we call the execution layer, like transactions and contracts kind of separately and upgrade them separately. And it also just means that the upgrade process is extremely seamless, right? Because from the point of view of a client that's following the chain, you basically have to update nothing, right? You're still following the same chain and follows the same rules, except instead of checking proof of work, you'll switch to checking that these blocks are embedded inside of blocks of the proof of stake chain.
Got it. So there'll be this merge block that will mark this transition.
Yeah.
And over time, I guess the new chain will